I mean, this is why I assigned Tale Two Cities, why I love Tale Two Cities. This last section is really, in my opinion, some of the best stuff that's out there. It's intense, it's fast-paced, it's intriguing, you've got the characters on edge, you've got, without giving away the plot, you've got a lot of things that really, I think, keep you reading all the way to the end. Most of you said that this finally became palatable in this last section, the previous section. I think that the section we're reading for this week is even more so, right? So what I want to do today is just kind of give you a broad overview of what I think Dickens has done and is doing, and allow you to find these things that we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to give you specific examples of these, although as you read through this last section, I think you will find very clearly, oh yes, that's where that occurs. Oh yeah, this is an example of that. And so as I just kind of outline these things for you, you guys can decide where and how you want to use them, right? I'm not going to give these to you, but I'm going to let you kind of have an idea of what I think Dickens is trying to do through the whole thing now that we get to the end. George Orwell wrote a really brief but really strong essay on Charles Dickens, and in particular on Tale of Two Cities. And in that essay, Orwell says that what Dickens does best is try to root out where society goes wrong. That in Dickens' work, as we talked about all the way through, as I talked about in the first lecture, what Dickens is trying to do is say, okay, we have a society that has failed in education, in government, in economics, in politics, in its judiciary system. We have a society that has really fallen apart in every way, and Dickens is trying to go to the root of that and say, okay, this is the problem. This is what has occurred. This is why this has happened, and let's try to fix that. And as we talked about, Tale of Two Cities is trying to tell England, don't end up like France. Don't treat your poor this way, and poor, don't revolt in this way, because this ain't good for anybody, right? And so what Orwell says is that what Dickens is really doing is a moral work, and more than anything, he's not looking at the economics, he's not looking at the education system, he's not looking at the parliament, he's not looking at government. What Dickens is doing is what we've been doing every day from day one. He is trying to unpack the nature of the human condition. And so in everything that Dickens does, in particular in this novel, he's trying to say, we have the world we have. Of course, he's talking about England in the mid-Victorian, mid to late Victorian era. He writes this published about 1860. We have this world, not just because our economics are bad, or our judiciary system is flawed, or our parliament is corrupt. We have this system because the human condition, there's something flawed in the human condition. And we've been discussing that in our Harvest discussion, haven't we? That how you can look at a fellow human being as something less than human. How in the world the Marquis can run over a child and just throw a coin out the window as if that makes everything okay. How in the world the aristocracy can drive by and see the hurting, desolation, see the oppression, see the starvation, see the inhumanity that's being suffered by the poor, and go on and drink their hot chocolate prepared by poor chocolatiers, right? I mean, this is what we've been talking about from day one. The problem that Dickens, according to Orwell, is addressing is the problem of human condition. And that's what we've been looking at since August. What is, at the root, the human condition? What is it that makes us us? And how is it that we have gone over and over again historically so long in this? How have we missed this? Well, I want to propose to you that what Dickens does in Tale of Two Cities, and probably most of his works, but I think most clearly in this one, is to talk about paradox. And I think he does that right in the beginning, right? It is a tale of two cities. It is the best of times, it is the worst of times. It is an era of wisdom, it is an epoch of incredulity. It is light, it is dark, right? He sets these paradoxes up. He sets these situations up whereby things shouldn't be this way, but they are. Things shouldn't work this way, but they do. And for Dickens, the paradox is always inside out. I mean, it's always, this is the way the world seems to work, this is the way things seem to take place, but they don't actually work that way. They don't actually work out well that way. They actually work out well in this way. And again, what I'm going to show you, I think, will be very evident as you pursue these last 50, 60 pages as you read this. And so I want to talk about paradoxes. And there's a great book by Soren Kierkegaard. We've talked about him, right? He's the Christian existentialist who talks about the 90 faith. And Kierkegaard writes a book called Either Or. And in that book, Either Or, what he basically says is this, that you either learn to live paradox well or you do not. You either learn to live paradox well or you do not. And so I'm going to give you 3 examples of paradoxes in the human condition. And you can decide that this is absolute bollocks and you don't agree with any of this and you want to argue this, which is fine. But I think, again, you're going to see a very clear connection to the 3 paradoxes I'm going to outline for you and where they exist in Tale of Two Cities. The first paradox I'll talk about is this, that the paradox of the human condition is that you must live life from the inside out. You must live life from the inside out. Now, that's paradoxical because really, throughout human condition, at least as far back as Rousseau, we've been kind of thinking about the human condition as one that is defined by its externalities, that is defined by those things that are outside of it, right? So the human condition is defined by things such as power, possessions, wealth, capital, resources, property, all those things. And this, of course, is the very thing Rousseau is arguing against in his discourse on inequality, and also his discourse on the arts and sciences. That the more we define ourselves by those things, the less we exist as humans. Right? When we move, this is Rousseau, when we move from amour de soi-même, S-O-I-M-O-I, I think. French people can correct me on that. When we move from amour de soi-même to amour propre, that's the problem. That we begin to say, oh, guess what? Zach has more of these things than I do. Right? Andrea is more capable, has more capacities in this area than I do. And we begin to finally enact the Hobbesian world. I mean, that's really kind of where Rousseau goes with this. And so this paradox is that we tend to think that, again, we are defined by our externalities. We're defined by the things that we can purchase or that we can adorn ourselves with. And yet for Dickens, over and over again, if you read his works, and if you read this one in particular, we've been kind of talking about this, those with the greatest resources, and this is not just true in Tale of Two Cities, I mean this is true in every text that you read of Dickens, those with the greatest external resources, those with the power, those with the possessions, those with the titles, those with the wealth, those with the lavish homes, lavish lifestyles, those are almost always to a one the villains for Dickens, right? Those are always almost the ones who are bad. But catch this, I mean please understand, they're not bad because they have a lot of stuff. They're not bad because the Monseigneur is not necessarily bad because he has this lavish castle, right? This lavish palace. He's not necessarily bad because he has 4 chocolatiers. That's not necessarily what makes him evil. But what makes him evil, what makes him a villain in Dickens' sense, is that he lacks the ability to understand his fellow human, right? I mean, he really does employ Kantian evil. He really sees the peasants as a means only to his end. We talked a lot about that, how the overtaxation is the reason why the poor are so poor and destitute and the rich are so rich and opulent, right? And so the first paradox is that, this is where Dickens, I think, is really trying to land, that you must live life from the inside out. In other words, there are these internal characteristics that are more important and more valuable than externalities. And we see this in all of Dickens' heroes, by the way. When we think about Oliver Twist, think about Pitt, think about Nicholas Nickleby. The heroes and the heroines are those who have nothing. I mean, Oliver Twist has nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. No family. Certainly no possessions. Absolutely nothing external. And yet he's heroic because he has these strong inner characteristics. And so the first paradox that I think is true of the human condition, and I think Dickens is trying to point out, is that you have to live life from the inside out. That if your life is only defined by the external, you're missing some key qualities, some key things. You can fill that list with whatever you want, right? Courage, humility, character, integrity, humility, humbleness, those kinds of things. And you can fill that list with whatever you want. But Dickens seems to say that those who live from the inside out are those who ultimately are victorious. And those who live from the outside in are those who are ultimately corrupt. And I think there's something to that. The second paradox that Dickens sets up for us, and I think is true of the human condition, is that you have to give yourself to something larger than yourself. But you have to give your life to something bigger than your life. And again, this is not something that is new to Dickens. The philosophers from ancient Athens to today are really kind of saying the same thing, right? That the more narrow and confined your focus is, the less you really have of yourself. But the more you are able to give yourself away, the paradox is, the more you find yourself. And I was talking to some friends the other day. I graduated with some guys who now are doctors and lawyers and business owners and restaurant owners and sit on the Chamber of Commerce and do all these really, some are hedge fund managers on Wall Street, really great things. And so really by every kind of external means you want to say, I'm the least successful of the guys I graduated with. But we're sitting around, we're talking about, the Mega Millions lottery thing had just gone on. And so, everybody's talking about winning the lottery and what you would do with the money. And we go around the room, there's probably about 3 or 4 of us there, and this guy says, okay, if I win the lottery, I'm going to retire and go play golf. And this guy says, if I win the lottery, I'm going to retire and go to Hawaii. And if I win the lottery, I'm going to retire and go do this. And I'm sitting there thinking, I get to me and I said, okay, what would you do? I'm saying, look, here's the thing. Let's say it's $250 million, right? So you just won $250 million. You can take $10 million of that and take care of your family for 3 or 4 generations. Live off the dividends, set up college accounts and retirement, all those great things. But you only have, and we were all about 35, 36, and you only have probably, 75 years of really active labor, right? Really active generativity. And then about 80, 85, things really start slowing down, if not before. I said, so you're telling me that 35 years old, you win the lottery, you win $250 million, you're going to just go and play golf for the rest of your life, right? You're just going to go and sit on a beach the rest of your life. Paradoxically, my response to that was, I only got about maybe 40 years of really strong, again, generativity, to use Erickson's phrase, in which I could go and do something with that. What I would do, because my passion is education, is I would go and I would take $10 million, take care of my family and generations, but $240 million to go give a Heritage Hall style education to people on the northeast side, on 36 and Lottie, and Capitol Hill on the south side, to go in a place of just abject poverty and really bad school systems and give them this kind of education. Imagine what you could do with $240 million. I mean, pick your cause. Pick whatever you're passionate about. Pick whatever you think is wrong in the world, and you can do a lot of good with $240 million. That's paradoxical. They thought I was crazy, right? I mean, they looked at me like I was out of my mind. But I'm looking at them and saying, you guys are out of your mind. Really? You're going to sit on a golf course on the beach for the next 40 years like the dragon in Beowulf and hoard that money? Here's what, I love what Martin Luther King said. I've just been reading his autobiography, and this is what he says in a speech literally about 3 months before he's assassinated in Memphis. Okay, so this is towards the end, when his house has been bombed multiple times, he's been in prison, he's been jailed, he's been beaten, his family has death threats, his close friends have been assassinated. And this is what he says right at the end of his life about this idea of giving your life to something bigger than your life. He says, I say to you that if you have never found something so dear and so precious to you that you will die for it, then you aren't fit to live. You may go and live until you're 90, but you are just as dead now as you would be at 90. You died when you refused to stand up for right. You died when you refused to stand up for truth. You died when you refused to stand up for justice. Right? That's the idea that you give your life to something bigger. Now, you will see that very clearly. If you've already read the end, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you will see in clear neon lights, this is an example of what I'm talking about. Dickens saying, you find your life when you give your life to something bigger than your life. It's like Russell Crowe says in Gladiator, right? What we do in life echoes in eternity. You will see that very clearly at the end of the session. And then the third paradox that I think is true in life, and that Dickens is pointing out, is that something I found out when I was about 5 years old. I'll never forget. I'm in the bedroom. I have a 3-year-old brother, so he's 2 years younger than I am at the time. And I'm in the bedroom. My mom comes into the doorway. She says words that would change my life forever. They're words that would set me on a course that really still have strong resonance and kind of person I am today, and the father I am today, etc. She comes to the door. She stands in the door. She says, "Boys, your dad and I are getting a divorce." And I'll never forget that. I mean, I'll never forget. I started crying, and my 3-year-old brother, he didn't understand what divorce meant, starts asking me, "Mommy, why is Scott crying? Or why is Scott crying?" I mean, that was just one of those life-altering, life-changing, dramatic years in life, right? And I learned this at 5 years old. Maybe you haven't had to go through that yet. Hopefully not. But here's the paradox. Here's the truth, and then the paradox. The truth is, you will face suffering in life. The truth is, there is a mixed suffering in life. Now, we don't want to admit that. In fact, our culture tries to shape us away from that. We want to deny it. We want to run from it. We want to medicate it. We want to placate it somehow. But the great reality, you're going to hear a lot of speeches between now and graduation about how you go and seize life and how you go and achieve all these great things and you go and do big things, which is all fine and good. But I want to tell you the other side of the coin. Some of you know and some of you will find out. There is immense suffering in life. Here's the paradox. And I think this is true. I think it's true on the natural level. I think it's true in history. I think it's true in literature. And I think it's true in what Dickens is saying. The paradox, given that fact, that there is immense suffering in life, suffering that is unavoidable, suffering that we cause or suffering that comes to us, is that suffering, I am convinced, is the only way to achieve transformation and wisdom. The ancient Greeks said that. Suffering is the road to wisdom. And that's not just the Western philosophers, the Eastern philosophers believe that as well. Confucius, Buddha, right? The Tao, I mean, all this idea that the road of suffering, the Via Dolorosa in Christian theology, right? The very literal road of suffering, the way of suffering, is the way of the transformation. And we see this in nature, don't you? And we see that when the caterpillar is just kind of inching along, doing his thing, he's eating his little caterpillar leaves, he's crawling on his little caterpillar branch, and you say, okay, caterpillar, this is all fine and good, but guess what? You've got another thing coming for you. At some point in your existence, you're going to go into this thing called a cocoon. You're going to go into this chrysalis, and inside there, and I don't know exactly what happens in there, but inside there, something I am sure really painful happens, and something I'm sure really detrimental happens, and something I'm sure really difficult happens. And yet when you come out of that, you're no longer tied to the ground, you're able to soar, right? And we see the same thing in birth, too. I think if you go into a fetus in the womb, and you go and say, look, you're supposed to come out of that place, right? The fetus would say, you're crazy. I've got this nice warm thing. I'm connected to mom. I've got food anytime I want it. This is like being in a constant whirlpool. I mean, I am living the dream right here, right? And you go into that fetus and you say, okay, here's really what's about to happen. You're about to go through the most painful, awful, horrible process you could ever possibly imagine. Your lifeline is going to be cut from you, and you're going to be thrown into this cold, harsh world. You get that fetus and say, man, I can't wait for that. Of course not, right? It would run from that. It would hide from that. It would deny that. It would placate that. It would medicate that. It would do everything it could to avoid that. But yet, of course, we know that that is where transformation, that's where birth happens. That in some ways, birth and death are just the same process, right? They're the two sides of the same process. We see that in literature. Joseph Campbell, through his hero's journey, we have talked about this ad nauseum. How do you become at one with yourself? What do you have to go through in order to find that place of transformation? What do you have to do? You have to go through what? Yeah, trials and tribulation ultimately to the what's the deep innermost part of the cave? Yeah, the abyss, right? I mean, Campbell's looking at all these myths from all these cultures, all over the world. And he's saying in every myth, in every story, in every culture, somehow, some way, they've got to go through this abyss. They've got to go meet their shadow. They've got to face themselves. And then they're transformed. And then they gain wisdom. We see that in movies. We see that, where's William? We see that in The Lion King, right? I mean, Simba loses his dad. What does he have to do? He has to go out into the world on his own. He has to face suffering. Finally, Dad comes back in his vision and says, you're supposed to be a man and go back to Pride Rock and take care of all these things, right? And he finally becomes what he's supposed to become. We see this over and over again. In literature, we see it in life, and you will see it, I think, very clearly in Tale of Two Cities. It's no accident or coincidence that one of the major themes of this book is resurrection. In fact, I think the first chapter we read for this coming section, over and over again, I think at least 3, maybe 4 times, Grace and I are counting, you have that biblical phrase where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. Carton is hearing that as he's walking the street. You're going to see that element come up over and over again in this section. This paradox that there's immense suffering, but that suffering ultimately leads to transformation, ultimately leads to wisdom, ultimately leads to new life. You'll see that very clearly in this section. Okay, so I don't want to give you the examples. I want to give you a direction and say, you will see, I think, how Dickens shapes these three paradoxes out. That you live life from the inside out, that you give your life to something bigger than yourself, and then ultimately that you embrace suffering and find redemption, rebirth, wisdom, transformation. That is going to be blatant in this final section. Okay? And as I said, you are more than free to disagree with anything I've said, as always. You can say that's absolutely incorrect. But at least you got a framework for what I think Dickens is doing with this. Setting up that these paradoxes, while we think that, again, as I've said before, if we lived in France at the time which Dickens writing, we would be in the Monseigneur's court, if we could, begging and vying for his attention. We probably wouldn't be so much siding with the poor and the destitute, unless, of course, we were poor and destitute. But if we were the haves, we wouldn't be seeing them as fellow human beings. And that's what Dickens is trying to root out. But the problem isn't economics, the problem isn't Parliament, the problem isn't education. The problem is there's something flawed in the human condition, something we've got to set right. Got it? Any questions or anything? Have fun with that. Good luck. Again.